Hi again then guys, and welcome to another specific look at a certain hot hatch, this time in particular in the Gran Turismo Sport roster. And of course this is not the first time that we've taken a look at this car, but it is the first time that it's had its own review, because of course way back, if I recall correctly, I think pretty early on after release day for GT Sport, we did a rivals match between the three French hot hatches from Renault, Citroen and Peugeot. Now I'm not going to spoil which one won, either in terms of lap time or spec. Of course you can go back and check that one out, or if you've already seen it you can probably recall. But I think I said in that video, and either way I certainly feel it now, that this is, I think, the most desirable for me personally of the three cars. I think that the older Clios are much nicer, stuff like the Clio 182 for instance. However, of these newer ones, the Citroen is, to me, just more stylish, it's more funky, I like the colour combos, and it's just the car that I prefer. The Peugeot, it kind of follows the Peugeot tradition of having a more understated approach, at least as far back as stuff like the 206. Of course, something like a 205 Turbo 16 doesn't really apply, but speaking of the 205 Turbo 16, that actually brings me to one of the gripes that I have with all three of these French hot hatches, and also hot hatches in general, but especially modern, smaller ones like these. Something that would be traditionally like a Volkswagen Polo kind of size. And that issue is the weight. Now, arguably, two of the best advantages from a performance point of view of a small hot hatch are one, how compact it is, which is great for city circuits, for weaving through traffic, etc. And the second, and very obvious one, is that they're really light. Stuff like K cars, old school Euro hot hatches, they're like 800 or 900 kilos, sometimes 1,000, but you can easily drop them below a metric ton, and that's a huge advantage to have, because it means that you don't have to have a ridiculous amount of power either to be competitive or even just to have fun. Something like the Fiat Panda 100 HP is a perfect example. It's only got 100 horsepower, but it only weighs about 950 kilos, so it's still quick. Something like this, on the other hand, which is only, like a decade later than the Fiat, yes, it has over 200 horsepower, 203 from a 1.6 engine, but it weighs 1,165 kilos. That is really heavy for a small hot hatch, and the gap seems to be closing between the difference, well, between smaller hot hatches and bigger ones. There used to be a massive difference between something like a Fiat Panda or a Suzuki Swift, and then comparing that to something like a Focus or a Golf R32, these much bigger hot hatches with larger engines, sometimes all-wheel drive, and all of that justifies the size and the weight. But even these smaller ones are getting heavier and heavier. Now that's not surprising, and in some ways it's not a bad thing, because of course there's better safety tech, sound deadening, larger more powerful engines, and just the tech being packed into the cars does inherently have a tendency to make them heavier, at least until the tech is ironed out and improved, and just like with the mobile phone getting smaller over the years, that same basic thing can apply with a car as well. Something like a Nissan GTR for instance, it's a perfect example. It's got so much tech packed into it that it is a very heavy car. Now in the case of this Citroen, I'm not trying to say that it's a bad car by any means. In fact, all three of the French hatches are actually really good. I think from a performance point of view, the Peugeot is definitely the underdog, but it's a really, really good car. The Citroen, as I said, is probably my preferred of the three from an all-round perspective, and the Renault is kind of the obvious choice, but now that we have the needless duplicate of that car, it's kind of almost lost a bit of favour with the community. When you bring up the Clio, it kind of has that effect on people now where they think of that second one, and it kind of puts them off the first one. At least that's what I've seen and heard from people chatting in this community, in messages to me. So it's not that the Clio is bad either. It's kind of been hurt by Polyphony's addition of the second car in a weird kind of way, but the Citroen is nice to finally have in the game, and I'm pretty sure I mentioned that in the Rivals match as well, because it's an obvious hatchback to feature, and it's one that I'm glad that they finally did feature. From a competition point of view, all three of these hot hatches, and incidentally we will take a look at the Peugeot down the line as well, they all have a lot of potential, but fairly obviously, partially due to the front engine layout, but also partially just to the limitations of tuning in the game, they have a limited range of use. Yes, you can upgrade them and take them up to N300, potentially, but whether or not you should is a considerably different question. Especially given that you can retune something like a Ford GT40 to around N300 as well. Not much of a comparison there, especially on a track where you can use that kind of performance, because, of course, something like a KTM Crossbow, or a Di Tommaso Pantera, or the aforementioned GT40 are considerably quicker than a hot hatch at that same level. So as long as you keep them around N100 or N200, that's kind of the prime area for them. But the biggest piece of advice I would give as far as tuning these hatches is to bring back that advantage that this kind of car used to have. Drop the weight as much as you can. And when I say as much as you can, of course, I mean within the regulations of the race, within balance of performance. Of course, sometimes there's not much that you can do about that, but if you can, that is the more important thing. In a funny kind of way, it's kind of like tuning a little muscle car. The power will take care of itself as long as you control the weight. So as far as its all-round ability, I like the Citroen. All three of them are really good, but the Citroen kind of has a smoother, slightly more beginner-friendly approach, I would say, than the Renault. The Renaults tend to have a bit more torque, a bit more power, of course, especially when tuned, and that leads them to being a little bit more of a professional approach. Renaults are pretty hardcore track cars. When it comes to their hot hatches, of course, the R26R set the ring record a few years ago, and it kind of carries over to the Clio as well. The Citroen is sort of in between, and the Peugeot, I think, is, as I said earlier, the understated sleeper of the three. It has the advantage of the downplayed Peugeot packaging, but it's actually a really good car. Overall, if you do go for this one, it will serve you well as long as you keep it where it should be, but even then, you do need to be careful of stuff like the old school Alpine, which of course can also go down to N100, N200, and can give these hot hatches a really good run for their money because of how quick it is from that power. Something like a light car company Rocket, for instance, as well, if that is added to the game, would pretty much kill these cars easily because of the massive weight advantage. So ultimately, there are certain cars which you'd never be able to beat, but within the confines of the hot hatches that we now have, sure, they're more than capable enough. I just kind of wish that we had the opportunity to compare them more to the hot hatches of a few years ago, or even a couple of decades ago. And of course, it remains to be seen as far as updates go, whether or not we will be able to, but as long as those older school cars do continue to be added, potentially if we got something like an EK Civic, or a Peugeot 205 T16, or a Renault 5 Turbo, those cars are going to really put a bead of sweat on the brow of these newer hot hatches because they don't have those advantages anymore. They've kind of, and I know this is going to be a controversial thing to say, but I feel like hot hatches have gotten a bit soft. They've kind of gotten a bit soft over recent years. They've got more power, but they don't feel quite as sprightly as they used to be, at least from my personal experience. But that's it overall for this pick, of course. I'll see you guys next time, and for now, as always, thanks for watching.